Imagine a silence. Not the kind that brings peace, but a heavy, viscous silence thick as a swamp mire that drowns any sound. It is February 1944. Somewhere far to the east, cannons roar, grinding thousands of lives. But here, on a small farm in occupied Poland, the war sounds different. It sounds like the cautious creak of floorboards overhead, like the grunting of pigs, whose serene existence separates you from the world of the living, like the beating of your own heart, which pounds so loudly it feels like it could be heard in Berlin. This is the 500th, maybe the 600th day underground. The count has long been lost. Here, in the cold, damp pit beneath the pigsty, time doesn't flow. It seeps, drop by drop, measuring out an eternity. Antoni Kowalski, the owner of this farm, is on his knees by the heavy oak lid of the cellar, disguised as part of the floor. His face is a map of suffering, carved with deep wrinkles. In his 40-year-old eyes is an anguish that could last for generations. In his calloused hands, he holds a sooty pot of warm slop, potato peels, a little flour, and if he's lucky, a few drops of fat. This is a feast. This is life. Slowly, almost ritually, he lifts the lid, and from the black opening, a grave-like cold and the smell of compressed human despair waft out. From there, out of the impenetrable darkness, two thin arms, like tree branches, rise up. They do not tremble. They're frozen in a silent plea. Antoni doesn't look down. He stopped looking into the eyes of those he hides long ago. To look is to admit that they are people, not shadows, not ghosts living in his personal hell. He passes the pot, and the hands disappear as silently as they appeared. 10 souls, 10 living ghosts, whose breath he can feel even through the thickness of the earth and wood. Their lives depend on his composure, on the silence of his wife, Janina, on their young children not blurting something out in the village, on a neighbor not becoming too curious. At this moment he did not yet know that the most terrible ordeal still awaited them. That hunger, cold, and fear were merely a prelude to the real horror. He did not yet know that a man he considered a friend was already counting the silver coins for his life. But to understand how a simple Polish farmer became both a jailer and a guardian angel to 10 doomed people, how his pigsty became both a Noah's Ark and a mass grave, we must go back almost 2 years, to the hot, dusty summer of 1942, when his world, still smelling of freshly cut hay and warm milk, collapsed forever. The summer of 1942 was deceptively calm, even lazy. The war seemed distant, in newspaper headlines, in the rare columns of German vehicles that kicked up dust on the main road, in the anxious rumors brought by traders from the market. On Antoni Kowalski's farm, life flowed according to a rhythm set hundreds of years ago. The well sweep creaked at dawn, cows mooed in the barn, and the air was thick with the smells of earth, manure, and flowering meadow grasses. Antoni was a man of this land, strong, taciturn, with hands that seemed an extension of a plow's handle. He didn't think about politics or geostrategy. His world was defined by the boundaries of his field, his enemies were drought and the potato beetle, and his god was the harvest. His wife, Janina, was a quiet, hard-working woman whose life revolved around the children, the stove, and the vegetable garden. Their 2 sons, 10-year-old Stasik and 7-year-old Kazak, ran around the yard, playing war with wooden swords, not yet understanding that the real war was already at their doorstep. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, and Antoni, lighting his pipe, would watch the sun set behind the forest, painting the sky in bloody tones. These sunsets unsettled him. There was something unnatural, prophetic about them. Sometimes, terrible stories reached their village about what was happening in the city, about the ghetto where all the Jews had been forced. They said a terrible famine raged there, that people were being taken away in entire trainloads to unknown destinations. But that was far away, beyond the horizon of their peasant world. For Antoni, Jews were something abstract, like Moish the tailor, who had sewn his holiday trousers before the war, or old Zilberman the pharmacist, who always had the right medicine, He considered them neither friends nor enemies. They were simply part of that old world that was crumbling before his eyes. But one day, trucks with soldiers arrived in their village. They cordoned off the ghetto, and for several days, screams and gunshots could be heard from there. Then, everything fell silent. That same ringing, dead silence that follows a massacre descended. Antoni's neighbor, Stanislaw, grinning, recounted that the problem had been solved for good. Stanislaw had shifty eyes and a habit of speaking in a whisper, even when no one could overhear. Antoni said nothing, but a cold dread spread through his chest. That evening he watched his sleeping children for a long time, their peaceful faces, and for the first time, he felt a sticky, irrational fear. He was sure that trouble would pass them by. He was wrong. It was already knocking at his door. The knock came late at night when a thick, milky fog enveloped the farm. The knock was soft, cautious, almost pleading. Not the way Germans or collaborators knock. It was the knock of a hunted animal seeking refuge. Antoni grabbed a pitchfork and Janina lit a kerosene lamp. On the doorstep stood two people, a man and a woman. Their clothes were torn, their faces covered in dirt and scratches. In their eyes was such terror that Antoni involuntarily took a step back. It was Moish, the tailor, and his wife, Rivka. They had miraculously escaped the ghetto during its liquidation. They had walked for several nights, hiding in the forest during the day. They came to him because there was nowhere else to go. Moish didn't ask for much. "Pan Antoni," he whispered with parched lips, "let us stay for one night, just until dawn. In the barn, in the hayloft, anywhere. We don't want to bring trouble upon you." Antoni looked at Janina. He saw in her eyes the same fear he felt. To hide a Jew was a death sentence. For him, for her, for their children. Execution on the spot. No trial. No questions asked. He should have said no. Common sense screamed it. The instinct for self-preservation howled like a wounded wolf. But then he looked at Moish, at this small, frightened man who had once proudly shown him the perfectly stitched seam on his trousers. And he couldn't. He didn't see a Jew. He saw a human being. "Come in," he said, and that whisper sounded louder than a gunshot in the night silence. He didn't know yet that this quiet knock wasn't just a knock on his door. It was a blow of fate that shattered his life into before and after. It was the first step into an abyss from which there would be no return. The decision was made in the semi-darkness of the kitchen, to the steady ticking of the old wall clock, counting down the last minutes of their peaceful life. Antoni seated the fugitives at the table. Janina poured them hot milk and they drank it, scalding their lips greedily, as if it were not a liquid but life itself. They told a horrific story, of people being driven from their homes, of children being torn from their mothers, of summary executions on the streets. Their account was fragmented, disjointed, full of pauses that held more terror than words. Antoni listened, and the sturdy walls of his house felt like cardboard. The plan was simple and insane. Wait out the night in the barn, and at dawn, Moish and Rivka would move on, into the forests, to the partisans, if the rumors were true. But when dawn broke, it was clear they had nowhere to go. The village was swarming with patrols. Germans and collaborators were combing the forest searching for escapees. To leave the farm was tantamount to suicide. And then Moish, stammering, said the words that changed everything. He said they hadn't escaped alone, that in the forest in a ravine, his brother was hiding with his family and a few others. 8 people in total. 8 exhausted, hungry, terrified people, among them the elderly and children. They were waiting for a signal. They believed Moish would find shelter. And now, all of them were looking at Antoni. 10 pairs of eyes. 10 lives in his hands. The air in the room grew thick, you could cut it with a knife. Janina began to cry softly, covering her face with her hands. This was the end. 2 people could perhaps be hidden, concealed. But 10 people are not a needle in a haystack. They are a whole underground village, It was impossible to feed them, impossible to hide them. Any extra sound, any smell, any trace, and it would all be over. Antoni went out into the yard. The morning air was fresh and clean, but he couldn't feel it. He could smell death. He walked over to the pigsty. It was old, leaning, built by his grandfather. Beneath it was a small root cellar for potatoes, cold and damp. A pit. A tomb. The only place they could be hidden. He stood there looking at that pigsty, and a single thought pounded in his head. Turn them away. Say no. Save his own family. It was logical. It was right. He had already done more than anyone else would have. But then he imagined saying this to Moish, looking into his eyes. He imagined those 10 people who had put their trust in him, walking out of the forest and straight into the hands of a patrol. He saw their faces, heard the children's cries. No, he couldn't. He was not a saint. He was not a hero. He was a simple farmer who had lived his whole life by a simple code. You are either a human being, or you are not. There's no third option. He returned to the house. His face was gray as the earth. Bring them, he told Moish. That one word was his sentence. At night, under the cover of darkness, they came. One by one, like shadows, they slipped into the yard. Men, women, 2 small children, an old man who could barely walk. They looked like ghosts, faded figures from another world. Antoni asked no questions. He silently led them to the pigsty and lifted the heavy cellar door. A waft of dampness and mold rose from the pit. He lit a lantern. In the dim light they saw their new home. Earthen walls, a low ceiling dripping with condensation, and a packed dirt floor. No one uttered a word. Silently, one by one, they descended into this hole. The last one down was a little girl, about 6 years old. She turned and looked at Antoni. In her enormous dark eyes there was no fear, only a boundless, unchildlike exhaustion. Antoni lowered the lid. The sound it made hitting the wooden frame was dull and final, like a hammer striking a coffin lid. He covered it with hay and manure, then placed a pig trough on top. He stood in the darkness, listening. Not a sound came from below. It was as if no one was there, as if he had dreamed it all. But he knew they were there. 10 people, buried alive. And he, Antoni Kowalski, had become their gravedigger, and their only hope. The first days bled into one long, cloying nightmare woven from fear and whispers. By day the farm lived its normal life, but this normality was theatrical, false. Every sound, a dog's bark, the creak of a cart on the road, a rooster's crow, made Antoni's heart stop. He worked in the fields, yet he was listening to the ground, terrified of catching the slightest rustle from beneath the pigsty. He spoke with neighbors, smiled, joked, while a single thought hammered in his head. They know. They know everything. Janina became a shadow. She moved through the house silently, flinching at every knock on the door. She forbade the children from playing near the pigsty, inventing a story about rats. But she saw the curiosity in their eyes, which frightened her more than German patrols. But the real hell began underground. For the 10 fugitives, the world had shrunk to the size of a cramped, dark pit. There wasn't enough air. The humidity was so high that clothes never dried, and a slimy green mold grew on the walls. During the day, they had to maintain absolute silence. They couldn't talk. They couldn't even cough, sneeze, or breathe too loudly. They lay on the straw Antoni had brought, huddled together for warmth, and listened. They listened to the pigs grunting and chomping above their heads, to the creak of the floorboards, to the footsteps of people. The sounds of the world above became their only calendar and their sole source of terror. Night brought brief relief. Antoni, after waiting for the entire village to fall asleep, would sneak into the pigsty. It was a ritual honed to perfection. He would give a coded signal, 3 scrapes on the planks, and only then would he lift the lid. He passed them a bucket of food, watery soup, a few potatoes, a piece of bread for all of them, and he took back another bucket, a bucket of waste. That smell, acrid and humiliating, followed him everywhere. He emptied the contents in a far corner of the garden, burying it, but it felt as if the stench had seeped into his skin, into his clothes, that anyone he met could smell it. The first conflicts erupted almost immediately, not from malice, but from despair. An old man named Samuel began to pray loudly, rocking back and forth. He had to be forcibly silenced, as his mumbling could get them all killed. A young woman named Leah fell into hysterics, screaming that she couldn't stay in this grave any longer. They covered her mouth and she writhed in silent sobs, shaking everyone lying next to her. The most difficult part was the children. 6-year-old Hannah and 8-year-old David. They didn't understand why they had to be silent all the time. They wanted to run, play, shout. Their mothers clamped hands over their mouths, whispering fairy tales, promising that it would all be over soon. But their own whispers were so laced with terror that the children would start crying even harder. One night when Antoni brought food, he was met by Mendel, a former merchant, a man accustomed to giving orders, now trapped in a hole like a mole. "We won't survive like this," he hissed. "We're suffocating. There's not enough food. We'll rot alive in here." His voice was laced with reproach, as if it were Antoni's fault. Antoni said nothing. He just looked at him, and in his gaze was such heavy, cold fury that Mendel backed away. At that moment, Antoni Kowalski understood. To save these people, he would have to become their dictator. He established cruel but necessary laws. By day, dead silence. At night, talk only in whispers. Food was divided equally, down to the last crumb. Any infraction meant losing your share. He became their god and their devil in one, the one who brought life, and the one who took away their last freedom. But one night, disaster struck. Little Hannah developed a severe cough, a dry, barking cough that tore at her chest. Every hack echoed in the ears of everyone present like the tolling of a bell. Her mother tried to muffle it with a pillow, but the cough broke through. It was a death sentence. One careless sound could draw attention. The neighbor's dog might bark. A passing patrol might stop. They all sat in the darkness, paralyzed with horror, listening to that child's cough, knowing that their fragile world was about to collapse. Little Hannah's cough became for the underground dwellers what the first artillery barrage is for soldiers on the front line. A moment of truth when the illusion of safety shatters into dust. During the day, they wrapped the girl in rags, and her mother, Esther, held a hand over her mouth for hours, but the coughing fits grew more frequent, and every sound that broke through the gag was like an explosion. Panic was mounting. Mendel, the merchant, was no longer hissing but almost screaming in a whisper that the child would be the death of them all, that something had to be done. His words carried a terrible, unspoken suggestion. People averted their eyes, but everyone was thinking the same thing. At night, when Antoni lowered their food, he was met by a wall of silent despair. Esther, the girl's mother, looked at him with eyes full of tears and pleading. Her gaze held a silent question. "Will you throw us out?" Antoni knew the situation was critical. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew that without help, the child could die. And if her cough was heard, they would all die. He took his family's last reserves of dried raspberries and linden flowers, which Janina had been saving for their own children. He secretly brought them a little honey, risking his wife's suspicion. But the folk remedies didn't help. The cough grew deeper. It seemed all was lost. And then, in the darkest hour, when hope had nearly vanished, something happened that the survivors themselves would later call nothing short of a miracle. Among them was a quiet, unassuming man named Jakob. Before the war, he had been a watchmaker in a small workshop. A man of delicate fingers and a sharp mind, accustomed to working with tiny mechanisms. He rarely spoke, always sketching something with his finger on the dirt floor. He approached Antoni and said quietly, "I need help. And tools." He explained his plan. It was brilliant in its simplicity and insane in its audacity. Jakub had noticed that in one corner of the cellar the earth was always slightly damp. He guessed that an old drainage pipe ran somewhere nearby. If they could break through to it, they could not only get a supply of fresh air, but also a way to channel sounds outside, away from the farm. This was their unexpected weapon, not a rifle or a grenade, but ingenuity and a knowledge of physics. They could only work at night, and only during strong winds or rain when the noise of the elements could mask their digging. Antoni brought him a shovel and an old crowbar, and so began the titanic, painstaking work. They dug with their bare hands, with their fingernails, carrying out the earth in buckets that Antoni would later scatter in his vegetable garden. Jakub, as the chief engineer, directed the process, calculating every move. He showed Esther how to make a special sound-absorbing cocoon for Hannah out of straw and rags, which significantly muffled the cough. The people, who just yesterday had been ready in their despair to sacrifice a child, now rallied around a common goal. This work gave them purpose, distracting them from the horror of their situation. They dug for several weeks, and one night the crowbar plunged into emptiness. They had found it. An old clay drainage pipe. Jakub, using his watchmaker skills, fashioned a primitive valve from a tin can and a piece of leather that allowed air to flow in but kept sounds from getting out. For the first time in many months, a stream of fresh, cold night air burst into their tomb. It was an intoxicating scent like wine, the smell of freedom. They took turns breathing it in, greedily, until they were dizzy. Hannah's cough, thanks to the fresh air and care, began to subside. They had won. It was their first but great victory. A victory not over the Germans, but over death itself, which had already been reaching for them with its bony hands. They realized their greatest weapon was not strength, but reason and unity. But their joy was short-lived. The noise of their nightly work, though muffled, had not gone completely unnoticed. One evening, as Antoni was returning from the fields, his neighbor called out to him. "Stanislaw." He stood by the fence, his small eyes drilling into Antoni. "What's this, neighbor? Got moles working at night?" he asked with a sly grin. "The soil in your garden looks awfully fresh. Searching for treasure, are we?" Antoni's heart sank into his boots. He realized that their enemy wasn't just in Berlin. He lived 20 meters, about 65 feet, away, right behind this very fence. Stanislav's grin marked the beginning of a new era of fear for Antoni and Janina, not fear of a faceless war machine, but of a specific person who had known them their whole lives. Now, every glance from the neighbor, every casual word, was perceived as a threat. If before they had feared patrols, now they feared the silence in which they imagined they could hear Stanislaw listening to their lives. Inspired by their success with the ventilation, the underground dwellers, led by Jakub the watchmaker, began to build their own isolated world. They understood that passive waiting was a path to madness and death. They needed a system, an order, the illusion of control over their fate. Thus their subterranean empire of nothing was born. The day was divided into cycles. Morning began when Antoni brought food. This was the time for a meager breakfast and discussing plans. Then came day, a time of dead silence when everyone lay in their places, trying not to move. Evening was study time for the children. Moish, the former tailor who had been a history enthusiast before the war, would whisper stories to them about great kings and distant lands. Esther taught Hannah to read, tracing letters on the earthen wall with her finger. This was their way of fighting the darkness by lighting tiny flames of knowledge within it. Jakub became their chief engineer. He was constantly tinkering, making clothes hooks from old wire, a wash basin from a leaky bucket. These small things were incredibly important. They created a semblance of domestic life, preventing people from completely turning into animals living in a burrow. Antoni was their king and god, their only link to the outside world. His nightly visits became the main event of their day. He brought not only food but also news, which he gleaned from conversations in the village or from scraps of old newspapers. He told them about the front's advance, about victories and defeats, giving them sustenance for their hope. Above ground, Janina waged her own, no less important, war. She became a master of conspiracy. She learned to cook for 12 people without arousing suspicion. She baked more bread, explaining that the boys are growing. She boiled huge pots of potatoes, supposedly for the pigs, but the best part was sent underground. Her main enemy was arithmetic. How to explain where so much food was disappearing? She kept 2 sets of books, hiding some of the flour and grain in the attic, risking being accused of hoarding provisions. She became an actress, playing the role of a simple peasant woman for her neighbors, especially Stanislaw. She would cordially invite his wife for tea, treat her to pastries, listen to gossip, and try to find out what was being said in the village. Life became a complex performance, rehearsed to perfection. The children Stasik and Kasik became unwitting participants. They were taught to be silent. They knew that Antoni's moles lived under the pigsty, and that they must never speak of these moles to anyone. This secret weighed on their young shoulders like an impossible burden. Their system worked. Several months passed in relative calm. They had created their own order amidst the universal chaos. Their shelter had become their fortress. But the longer they lived in this closed-off world, the more detached they became from reality. Their empire was as fragile as glass. And one day, it cracked. The problem came from where they least expected it. Not from the Germans or the neighbors. It was born in the darkness itself, in their own cellar. Mendel, the merchant, whose will had been broken by the long confinement, began to show signs of madness. He stopped talking, sitting in a corner for days on end, rocking back and forth and muttering to himself. But one night he leaped up and screamed. It was not a scream of terror. It was a scream of rage. He shouted that Antoni was deceiving them, that he was eating the best food and throwing them scraps. He screamed that there was no war, that they had simply been locked up here so he could take their money. In the darkness of their small world, a rebellion had begun. Mendel's scream tore through the stuffy air of the cellar like a lightning strike. It was more terrifying than a child's cough, more terrifying than any noise, because this scream was charged with madness and mistrust, a poison that could infect everyone. People jumped up trying to cover his mouth, but he fought back with desperate strength. He accused not only Antoni but everyone else. Moish for leading them into this trap. Jakob for his ventilation schemes that only prolonged their torment. He became the voice of despair, articulating the darkest fears that lurked in everyone's soul. The fear that they had been betrayed, that their sacrifice was in vain, that they would die here, in this damp earth, forgotten by all. Above, Antoni and Janina heard the muffled shouts. They froze, chilled with horror. Anyone passing by the farm could have heard it. Antoni knew he couldn't delay. The mutiny had to be crushed immediately. Grabbing a lantern, he rushed to the pigsty, ordering Janina to stand guard at the gate. He descended into the pit. In the dim light of the lantern, he saw Mendel's thrashing figure and the terrified faces of the others. Seeing him, Mendel lunged at him with his fists. "Thief! Traitor! You're starving us!" he yelled. Antoni didn't fight back. He had expected this. He knew the human psyche could not withstand such pressure. He used what could later be called surgical cruelty. He didn't strike Mendel, he did something worse. He calmly, looking him straight in the eyes, said, "You're right, Mendel. I am deceiving you. The war ended long ago. The Germans are gone. Everyone is living a peaceful life. And I'm keeping you here because I enjoy watching you rot. You can leave now. The door is open. Go. Go on up. Go to the village, tell everyone what a scoundrel I am. But when the first patrol catches you, remember my words." His voice was quiet, but it held such icy calm that Mendel fell silent. He looked at the cellar lid, at the narrow strip of night sky, and his rage gave way to animal terror. He understood that what awaited him up there was not freedom, but certain death. He sat down on the straw and began to sob, quietly like a child, covering his face with his hands. The rebellion was quelled, but Antoni knew this was only a temporary victory. The virus of despair had already infected their small community. He had to do something to restore their faith. And so, he took a huge risk. The next night, he brought them more than just food. He brought them a newspaper. An old, tattered, month-old paper that he had traded for a few eggs at the market. He went down to them and, by the light of a smoking lamp, began to read aloud. He read reports from the front, skipping the German propaganda and searching between the lines for hints of what was really happening. He read about the battles near Stalingrad, about how the Red Army was not giving up. For people trapped in darkness, these words were like a breath of fresh air. The war was real. Their struggle had meaning. They were not alone. No one slept that night. They passed the newspaper from hand to hand, poring over every word, discussing every piece of news. Their small world had reconnected with the larger one. Antoni's leadership was restored, not by force, but by wisdom. He had defended his law. He had extinguished the fire of rebellion. But while they were fighting their internal enemy, they failed to notice how their external enemy had crept right up to them. Early in the morning, as Antoni went out to milk the cows, he saw tire tracks on the road by his farm and a German cigarette butt. Someone had been here during the night. Someone was watching. And that someone would definitely be back. The tire track and the discarded cigarette butt were signs of trouble for Antoni, far clearer than any intelligence report. He knew it was no accident. Someone had directed the Germans to his farm, and he had a good guess who. All day he worked like a machine, preparing for the worst. He cleaned and hid his father's old rifle in a safe place. He once again instructed Janina and the children on what to say and how to act during a search. The main rule: calm and naturalness. Any sign of fear would be taken as proof of guilt. At night he went down to his wards. He didn't deceive them. He told them everything. "They might come tomorrow," he said. "If that happens, you must become stone. Not a single sound. Even if they are walking right above your heads. Even if they stick bayonets into the ground. Understand? If you make even one rustle, we all die." No one slept underground that night. They sat huddled together, each praying to their own god. Their petty squabble with Mendel now seemed so insignificant in the face of a shared mortal threat. They waited, and they came. The next day, around noon, 2 motorcycles and a covered truck stopped at the farm gate. 6 soldiers in gray uniforms and 1 officer, and with them was him, Stanislaw. The neighbors stood slightly apart, trying not to meet Antoni's gaze, but his face was a mixture of fear and triumph. The officer, a tall blond man with ice-cold eyes, explained that they had information that Antoni was harboring enemies of the Reich. A search. Janina, pale as a sheet but with a stone-like expression, let them into the house. 2 soldiers remained outside while the others began to methodically turn everything upside down. They tore open feather beds, tapped on walls, looked inside the stove. Antoni stood amidst the chaos, trying to maintain an outward calm. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could only think of one thing: how to distract them from the pigsty. The officer went out into the yard. He surveyed the farmstead with a sharp gaze. His eyes settled on the pigsty. "And what's this?" he asked. "The pigsty, Herr Officer," Antoni replied, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "Open it." It was the most terrifying moment of his life. He walked to the pigsty. The pigs, disturbed by the noise, grunted unhappily. Antoni knew that beneath the thin floorboards, under a layer of hay and manure, 10 people were holding their breath. He slowly opened the door. The thick smell of ammonia hit his nose. The officer wrinkled his nose in disgust. One of the soldiers went inside, lazily prodding a few piles of hay with his bayonet. Antoni prayed to all the gods that the bayonet wouldn't find the cellar lid. And then, a desperate idea came to him. He had to create a diversion. He turned to the officer with the most subservient smile he could muster. "Herr Officer," he said, "a search is a search, but lunch is on schedule. My wife has just made a wonderful borscht, and I have a bottle of excellent moonshine. To the victory of great Germany!" The officer hesitated for a moment. The idea of a hot meal and a drink in the middle of a tedious day seemed appealing. He looked at Stanislaw. The man stood there, looking bewildered. He hadn't expected this turn of events. "Very well," the officer said. "But after lunch we will continue. And we will check this pigsty more thoroughly." It was a risky gambit, but it bought him some time. They returned to the house. Janina, understanding everything instantly, was already setting the table. She put out the best dishes, sliced bread and cured fat. Antoni poured the moonshine into glasses. He drank with the Germans, complimented their weapons, told village anecdotes. He was giving the performance of his life. And all the while, underground, 10 people lay in pitch darkness, listening to the laughter and clatter of weapons above their heads, not knowing that their fate was being decided over a bottle of moonshine. The search lasted another 2 hours. They checked the barn, the attic, the hayloft. They even looked down the well. But they never returned to the pigsty. Mellowed by the food and drink, the officer decided the tip had been false. They left, leaving behind a ransacked house and the smell of a foreign presence. When the sound of the engines faded into the distance, Antoni went out into the yard. He walked to the pigsty and leaned against its wall. His legs wouldn't hold him. He slowly slid to the ground. He had won, but the price of this victory was terrible. He looked toward Stanislaw's house. The curtain in the window twitched. He understood that the war with the Germans would end someday, but the war with his neighbor had just begun. When the truck with the Germans disappeared around the bend, a deafening silence fell upon the farm. Not the one they were used to, but a new, ringing silence, filled with the echo of the horror they had just endured. Janina silently cleaned up the mess in the house, her movements mechanical, like a doll's. The children huddled in a corner watched everything with wide eyes. Antoni sat on the ground by the pigsty for a long time, unable to move. He had won the battle, but he knew it was only a reprieve. Stanislaw would not forgive him this humiliation. He would wait, look for a new reason, a new way to strike. More than another year passed. 700 days. 700 nights. Life turned into a monotonous, exhausting ritual. Fear became chronic, like a nagging pain in an old wound. It dulled, but it never completely went away. Underground, people were changing. They grew unaccustomed to sunlight. Their skin became pale, almost translucent. They learned to walk silently, to speak in whispers. Their eyes adjusted to the darkness. They became a different people, a people of the underworld. But they survived. Their system worked. The children grew up, learning to read and write by the light of a smoking lamp. Mendel no longer rebelled. He sank into an apathy, becoming a living shadow. Jakob continued to invent things, keeping their fragile world in working order. And then came liberation. It didn't arrive with parade marches and flowers. It came with the roar of artillery approaching from the east. One morning they woke up and realized the Germans were no longer in the village. They had left during the night, hastily, leaving behind only trash and fear. Antoni waited another 3 days. He didn't believe it. He feared a trap. But when the first soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms with red stars on their ushanka hats marched through the village, he knew. It was over. That night he opened the cellar lid and said one word. "Come out." They emerged one by one, slowly, uncertainly, like newborns entering the world. The first breath of fresh air after 2 years of stench. The first glimpse of the starry sky after endless darkness. They stood in the middle of the yard, squinting in the lantern light, swaying from weakness. Thin, pale, in worn-out clothes, they looked like ghosts. The children, Hannah and David, didn't remember what the world looked like. They stared in fear at the enormous trees, at the endless sky. Their world had been the size of a potato cellar. The farewell was brief and awkward. They embraced Antoni and Janina. There were no tears. The tears had run out long ago down below. "We will never forget this," said Moish. And they left. They dissolved into the morning mist to start a new life, to find their surviving relatives, to simply become human again. Antoni and Janina were left alone in their yard. For the rest of the world, the war was over. But their personal war was just beginning. The euphoria of liberation quickly faded, replaced by a harsh reality. In the village, everyone knew. No one asked questions aloud, but they felt it in every glance, in every whisper behind their backs. The heroic act was not seen as heroism by their fellow villagers, it was a betrayal. They hadn't just saved Jews, they had risked the entire village. If the Germans had found them, they would have shot not only the Kowalskis but their neighbors too, and burned their homes. That was the order, and the people could not forgive them for it. Stanislaw became their chief persecutor. He didn't accuse them openly. He acted more cunningly. He spread rumors that the Kowalskis had hidden the Jews for gold, that they had profited from others' misery, that they were rich now, and people believed it. Envy, mixed with fear and deep-seated anti-Semitism, proved to be more terrifying than German orders. They began to be ostracized. People stopped greeting them on the street. Their children were boycotted at school. One night, someone threw a rock through their window. Then their haystack was set on fire. Salvation had turned into a new prison. Only this time its walls were not earth and planks, but human hatred. They had defeated the Gestapo, only to find themselves powerless against their own neighbors. The system that delivered its cruel verdict was not a foreign one, but their own. Years passed, washing away the traces of war, but not erasing the scars on people's souls. For Antoni and Janina Kowalski, peace never truly came. They continued to live on their farm, which had become for them both a place of heroism and an island of damnation. The new Soviet-backed government that came to power in Poland was not interested in quiet heroes. It had its own heroes, its own myths, and its own enemies. The story of a simple farmer who saved 10 Jews did not fit into the official narrative. It was too private, too incorrect. Antoni never told anyone what they had done. He locked that secret deep inside, just as he had once locked 10 lives beneath his pigsty. The secret weighed on him, aging him prematurely. He became even more silent and withdrawn. Sometimes at night, he had nightmares. Not of Germans, not of the search, but of the eyes of those he had saved, staring at him from the darkness. He didn't know what had become of them. None of them ever made contact. Perhaps they died later. Perhaps they moved far away and forgot. This uncertainty was the worst part. He would often walk to the old pigsty, which they had long since dismantled, and stand for a long time on the spot where the entrance to their underground world had once been. What did he feel? Pride? Regret? He himself didn't know. He had simply done his human duty, and the world had repaid him with oblivion and hostility. Janina took it harder. She could not accept the injustice. She saw how Stanislaw, their neighbor and informant, became a respected man under the new regime, joined the party, and was given a position. His betrayal was forgotten, while their heroic deed became their stigma. She often cried at night, thinking that no one would ever appreciate their sacrifice. Their sons, Stasik and Kazik, grew up with this burden. They knew the truth, but they were ordered to remain silent. They left the village as soon as they could, trying to escape the shadows of their parents' past. The fates of those they saved varied. Moish and Rivka made it to Palestine and started a new life. Their son became a soldier and died in one of the Arab-Israeli wars. Mendel, the merchant, never recovered from the ordeal. He spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, speaking in whispers and fearing the dark until his dying day. Jakub, the watchmaker, moved to America, opened his own shop, and became famous as a brilliant craftsman. He tried to find the Kowalskis after the war, but the Iron Curtain made it impossible. The children, Hannah and David, survived. They were adopted by a distant relative in Canada. They grew up, started their own families, but the memory of a childhood spent in darkness under the earth remained with them forever. Antoni Kowalski died in 1976 from a heart attack. He passed away quietly and unnoticed, just as he had lived. A simple Polish farmer whose greatest act of courage remained known only to himself. Janina outlived him by 10 years and was buried next to him in the old village cemetery. It seemed their story would die with them, that the sands of time would forever swallow the memory of those 700 days of hell and bravery. But sometimes, history has its own inscrutable ways. In the early 2000s, a letter from Israel arrived in the small Polish town. It was addressed to Antoni and Janina Kowalski. It was written by an elderly woman named Hannah, the same little girl whose cough had nearly doomed them all. She had spent her entire life searching for the people who had saved her. She contacted the Yad Vashem Memorial Complex, and its staff began an investigation. Hannah's letter became the key that unlocked a door to the past that had been sealed for 60 years. The staff at Yad Vashem, Israel's national memorial to the Holocaust's victims and heroes, began their painstaking work. They sifted through archives, found other survivors, David in Canada, and elderly Jacob in New York. Their scattered, faded memories, like pieces of a mosaic, began to form a single, incredible picture. They spoke of a farmer with sad eyes, of his quiet wife, of the taste of potato soup that seemed like food for the gods, of the darkness, the fear, and the salvation. Their story ceased to be just a family legend. It acquired substance, dates, names. The official history that had ignored them for decades finally turned its attention to them. Researchers came to their home village. They interviewed the old-timers who still remembered the Kowalskis. And the truth began to emerge, like a sprout breaking through asphalt. The people who had once whispered behind their backs now reluctantly admitted, yes, there was something like that. Yes, they said the Kowalskis had hidden someone. Their act of heroism, which had been their curse, slowly began to turn into a legend. In 2005, after reviewing all the evidence, a special commission at Yad Vashem made its decision. Antoni and Janina Kowalski were posthumously awarded the honorary title of Righteous Among the Nations. This title is given to non-Jews who, during the Holocaust, risked their own lives to save Jews. Their names were engraved on the Wall of Honor in the Garden of the Righteous in Jerusalem. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren came to the ceremony. They stood by that wall, read the names of their ancestors, and wept. For the first time, they fully understood the stature of the giants they had grown up alongside. The story of Antoni and Janina became something more than just a chronicle of survival. It became a parable about how the greatest heroism is often quiet and unseen, that to stand against absolute evil you don't have to be a soldier with a rifle. Sometimes it's enough to just be a human being, a person who, in the midst of universal madness, makes the only right choice. Their story is a reminder that war has many fronts, and the most important one is not drawn on military maps, but runs through the heart of every single person. It is a tale of how even in the most impenetrable darkness, a single person can become a beacon for others. And the light from that beacon, even if people try to forget and tarnish it, will never go out. It will burn forever, passed down from generation to generation, like a soldier's legend, like a whisper of history that is louder than the roar of cannons. Write in the comments what you think of this story. Was it an act of heroism or madness to risk one's own family to save others? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history that deserve to be remembered.